Excellencies, distinguished delegates, colleagues. Let me begin by thanking OHCHR for convening this expert meeting and for the opportunity to contribute to this discussion. I'm speaking on behalf of UNODC in its capacity as guardian of the United Nations Convention Against Corruption, UNCAC. In line with the focus of this session, I will structure my remarks around 3 points. First, the UNCAC framework and findings from its implementation. Second, what the data tells us about asset recovery and return in practice. And third, emerging lessons on the use of return assets and their relevance for human rights. Asset recovery is often where international cooperation is most tested and where its impact is most visible. Let me briefly share some reflections based on the implementation of the UN Convention Against Corruption, UNCAC. With 192 states parties, UNCAC provides the only universal legal framework governing asset recovery. It establishes a common legal basis and shared procedures for cooperation across legal systems. A central element is Article 51, which recognizes return of assets as a fundamental principle of the Convention, and Article 57, which sets out how assets are to be returned and disposed of. Importantly, Article 57 clarifies that in certain cases, in particular where public funds have been embezzled, the return of assets is mandatory, not left to discretion. At the same time, the Convention requires that all measures are carried out through legal processes that respect due process and the right of all parties, including bona fide third parties. To assess how these provisions are implemented in practice, UNCAC established the implementation review mechanism. Through this mechanism, states review each other's implementation of the Convention, producing detailed country-level assessments. The state of implementation studies are based on data collected through these country reviews. The first study in 2017, covering criminalization and international cooperation, shows that most states have established the necessary legal frameworks. However, it also identifies a consistent pattern. The main challenges are operational, including delays and complexity in mutual legal assistance, limited institutional capacity, and underuse of cooperation tools already provided by the Convention. The 2025 study, covering preventive measures and asset recovery, confirms this. Legal and institutional frameworks are largely in place. There has been progress in cooperation and institutional development, but practical implementation remains uneven, especially at the stage of asset return. More concretely, many states report limited experience with completed return cases. Over 80% received recommendations to strengthen asset return frameworks and practice, and data and case management systems remain insufficient in many jurisdictions. In short, UNCAC has been effective in sharing frameworks, but ensuring consistent implementation in practice remains the key challenge. Now, what the data tells us, asset recovery in practice, that's my second point. To complement the implementation findings, UNODC and Stolen Asset Recovery, or STAR initiative, a joint initiative of UNODC and the World Bank, have collected global data on asset recovery. The most recent figures were presented to the Conference of State Parties to UNCAC, which is the governing body of the Convention, referred to as COSP. According to data compiled for COSP 11 in December 2025 in Doha, between 2010 and 2025, states reported asset returns of approximately $4.63 billion US dollars. Looking at the broader Asset Recovery Watch database, which documents international cases, $10.47 billion US dollars have been returned, $793 million US dollars confiscated, and $5.61 billion US dollars frozen, bringing the total to about $16.8 billion US dollars across documented cases. The same data set shows 586 international cases documented, including 228 asset return cases. And importantly, 77 jurisdictions have participated in at least one cross-border case, and 53 jurisdictions have completed asset return cases. What do these figures show? Three observations are particularly relevant. First, international cooperation on asset recovery is happening more frequently and across a growing number of countries. Second, however, asset return remains limited in practice and concentrated in a relatively small number of cases. And third, there remains a gap between existence of cooperation frameworks and the delivery of results in terms of return assets. In other words, the issue is less about whether cooperation is possible and more about how to make it work consistently and predictably. Now, my third point, from return to use, lessons from the Addis process. A further dimension, increasingly important in both policy and practice, concerns the use of returned assets. Through the Addis process, UNODC and STAR, together with governments of Switzerland and Ethiopia, have facilitated dialogue between requested and requesting states, as well as development actors. A number of practical lessons have emerged. The importance of clear agreements between states on the use of returned funds, the need for transparent management and monitoring mechanisms, the benefit of linking asset return to development priorities, including the Sustainable Development Goals. Importantly, practice shows that how assets are used after return matters for cooperation itself. It can influence the confidence of states in cooperating, the credibility of asset recovery frameworks, and the perceived fairness and legitimacy of outcomes. Let me conclude with a few reflections relevant to this meeting. First, UNCAC provides a clear and balanced international framework, combining obligations for cooperation and return with legal safeguards and due process requirements. Second, the available evidence shows that implementation is progressing, but that asset return remains uneven and often limited in practice. Third, and most relevant here, asset recovery intersects with human rights in practical and operational ways, including the need to uphold due process and fair trial guarantees in confiscation and return proceedings, ensuring transparency and accountability in the management of return assets, and the question of whether return assets are used in a way that benefits affected population or victims. These issues are directly relevant not only to outcomes, but also to international cooperation itself. Experience suggests that when asset recovery processes are legally sound, transparent, and oriented toward public benefit, they can contribute to strengthening accountability and institutional trust. Conversely, shortcomings in these areas can undermine both cooperation and impact. In closing, strengthening international cooperation in asset recovery will require continued focus on operational effectiveness, reliable data and transparency, and credible practice for the return and use of assets. Initiatives such as the Global Operational Network of Anti-Corruption Law Enforcement Authorities, or the GLOBI network run by UNODC, also plays an important role in facilitating direct and more timely cooperation between practitioners. Ultimately, this is where the link to human rights becomes concrete, in how proceedings are conducted, how assets are managed, and who ultimately benefits from their return. Thank you very much.